It sounds like the start of a really bad joke, right? The day London was flooded with beer. You're probably picturing this citywide party, some kind of bizarre, happy accident. But the truth of what happened on October 17th, 1814 was, well, it was anything but funny.
So let's just get straight to the heart of it, because this is the question that just stops you in your tracks. We're not talking about a little spill. We're talking about a full-on industrial catastrophe that unleashed a literal tidal wave on a neighborhood that never saw it coming. And the price that was paid was tragically real.
Eight. 8 people died, and these were mostly women and children. Not from drinking the beer, but from the raw, destructive power of the flood itself. So yeah, this isn't just some quirky little story from the history books. It's a forgotten tragedy. Okay, so to really get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll set the scene, we'll look at the wave itself, we'll talk about the real human cost, see the, let's just say, controversial aftermath, and then finally, we'll separate the myths from the actual legacy of the London beer flood. So first, you have to understand the world this happened in. This is London 1814, a city of massive contrasts, of incredible wealth right next to desperate poverty. And that contrast was never clearer than in the area of St. Giles. On one side of the street, you had the Merks and Company Brewery. This place was an industrial giant, a symbol of progress. They were famous for making porter, and even more famous for these absolutely enormous wooden vats they aged it in. They were basically tourist attractions. And then, literally in the shadow of this brewery, you had the St. Giles Rookery, one of the most miserable slums in the entire city. I mean, listen to how people described it back then. That quote says it all. The Rookery was this maze of packed-in tenements. You had whole families living in single basement rooms, often below street level. And this vulnerable, desperate community was directly in the path of what was about to happen. So, how does this actually happen? Well, this wasn't some bolt from the blue. It was more like a slow-motion train wreck that nobody took seriously until it was way, way too late. So, around 4:30 in the afternoon, a clerk at the brewery, George Crick, sees that a massive iron hoop weighing 700 pounds has slipped off one of the main vats. Now, this kind of thing had happened before, so when he told his supervisor, the guy basically shrugged it off. He said no harm whatever would ensue and told him to just write a note to get it fixed later. Just an hour after that conversation, the whole vat exploded. Just so you can picture the scale of this thing, the vat that broke was 22 feet tall. That is like a 3-story building, made of wood and just held together with these iron bands. And inside was an incredible amount of hot, fermenting beer. When that vat burst, it unleashed something like 320,000 gallons of porter. And the explosion was so huge, it set off a chain reaction, bursting other barrels nearby and adding even more liquid to the flood. The force created this 15-foot-high tsunami of beer and debris. It was so powerful, it smashed right through the brewery's thick brick wall and just poured into the narrow streets of the St. Giles Rookery. And this is where the story shifts from just a bizarre industrial accident to a real human tragedy. The flood hit late in the afternoon. Most of the men in the area were still at work. The people caught in the flood were mostly women and children, taken completely by surprise in their own homes. These are the names of the people who died. 4-year-old Hannah Banfield was just having tea with her mom when the wave hit. 14-year-old Eleanor Cooper was working as a barmaid when a wall fell on her. But the most awful story took place in a cellar. A wake was being held for a 2-year-old boy who had just died. The beer flooded that basement in an instant, and it drowned his mother, Anne Saville, and 4 other people who were there mourning. This newspaper quote from the time really gets at the shock of it all. To the people living there, it was like an earthquake or a fire. Houses were flattened, basements were totally flooded, and the smell of stale beer and death apparently hung over that neighborhood for months. So, with a disaster this clear-cut, you'd expect there to be some accountability, right? Well, the legal aftermath of this whole thing is probably one of the most eye-opening parts of the story. Just 2 days after the flood, a coroner's jury was assembled. They heard testimony, even from the clerk who warned his boss, and their verdict, that the deaths were caused casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. Legally, it was called an act of God, basically a freak accident that no one could be blamed for. And check out what happened next. The families of the 8 people who died, they got absolutely nothing. No money for their loss, for their destroyed homes. They actually had to put the bodies on display in their ruined homes to collect pennies from people just to afford a funeral.
But the brewery, they petitioned the government and got a massive tax rebate that saved the company from going bankrupt.
Now, in the 200 years since this happened, the story has been, let's just say, embellished. It's turned into folklore. So let's try to separate what really happened from the popular myths.
Okay, so the biggest myth, the one you always hear, is that hundreds of people rushed out with buckets to drink the free beer, that there were riots, and that someone even died from alcohol poisoning. But historians have looked into this, and you know what? It's completely false. Newspapers at the time, which were not friendly to the Irish immigrants in St. Giles, actually praised the crowd for being quiet and orderly so that rescuers could listen for survivors in the rubble. The whole drunken mob story seems to have been invented much, much later. So if the legacy isn't some drunken party, what is it? Well, it was a massive wake-up call for the entire brewing industry. This disaster proved, in the most tragic way possible, that these huge wooden vats were a really bad idea. So over time, the industry phased them out completely. They replaced them with safer stuff like lined concrete, and eventually the stainless steel we see today. The flood literally changed the technology of how beer is made.
If you go to that spot today on Tottenham Court Road, you're not going to find a brewery. What you will find is the famous Dominion Theatre, a huge landmark in London's West End.
And yet, for a disaster that killed 8 people and forced an entire industry to change how it operates, there's nothing there to mark it. No memorial, not even a small plaque. And that leaves you with one last question, doesn't it? Who gets remembered by history? And why is a tragedy that happened to poor people in the shadow of a powerful company so easy to just wash away?